Welcome to My Road Trips Planner, the podcast. My name is Shane, and I'll be your host today. Hey, so when planning road trips, I think there's three questions that you have to answer. One, who's coming? And this will tell you what kind of road trip it's going to be. Number two, what's your destination? And number three, what's your budget? And the reason I want to talk about these three questions is that I think they're the most important when planning a road trip. Because if you can get these three questions answered, you're going to be able to really put a great itinerary together. So let's see here. So number one, who's coming and what kind of trip is it? So I'm going to use a personal story. When me and my family went to Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, we visited the Columbus Zoo, the Cleveland Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, the Football Hall of Fame, and the Wilds. And the reason why we even planned this trip is because my son and my wife were actually watching Secrets of the Zoo. And so that's what got us started to even go to Ohio in the first place. And so this is going to be, so I'm answering my first question, who's coming? It's going to be family. So this is going to be a family trip. So it's me, my wife, and my two boys. And then we know what our trip is going to look like because it's a family trip. I know who's coming now. And then number two, we have a destination because we're going to the Columbus Zoo and then these other places I've talked about. And then number three, we're going to have to put together a budget. And so we have two questions answered, but I want to start with the two questions first because I really think it's important. So you have family trip, you have friends trip, you have a solo trip, you have kids, and then you also have couples trip. And I think you have to remember all these different trips are going to totally look different from each other. So, different travelers equal different needs. And so what kind of trip? So, it could be, one might be adventurous, relaxing, educational, quick getaway, or a full vacation. So if you know what kind of trip it is, it helps set the tone and what you're actually going to do. Now, family trip, balance of family-friendly things and adult interest. It creates a variety of things. So we're going to start with family trip. And so when we were planning this and we planned that I knew who was coming, because now we have to think about everybody else. So when you're planning points of interest, yes, we're thinking about the kids for the zoo, the wilds, things like that. But for adults, one thing I always wanted to do is I always wanted to go to the Football Hall of Fame. I'm a really big football fan, and I know a lot of you might be like, uh-oh, he's a Giants fan. Yes, I'm a Giants fan. I've been a Giants fan probably since I was born. So I've been with them with the, beginning at the ups when I was a kid watching Lawrence Taylor, all the way to, watching the 90s and then into the 2000s and then watching Eli Manning and all the other players. And even today, but we won't talk about today. We're going to move on from that. We're going to stick to road trips. But my wife, she wanted to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, I'm not saying I didn't want to, but it wasn't at the top of my list. But when you're on a trip, you want to figure out stuff for everybody. So that's why you want to know what kind of trip this is. Because if you don't, what happens is we then say to ourselves, well, I want to do what I want to do, but then everybody else is left out. So you want to make sure that you're leaving room for everybody. And that's why you need to know what kind of trip it is. Because if you don't, what happens is that if you're planning a family trip, but you're going out with friends, your friends are going to be like, well, we're not kids. Like, we want to go do adult stuff. And so you have to remember these things that when planning, that's why this question is so important. So once you have that question answered, now what's your destination? Now this way you narrow your focus to planning. Now you're saying, okay, I'm going to Ohio with the family. I'm going to put together an itinerary with things that people want to do. So we start with, okay, so we know there's a mom going, there's a dad going, and then there's two kids going. And so we decide, okay, we want to make sure that they all get a chance. Now, this is probably about, I want to say 3 years ago. I might be off, but my kids were a little bit younger. So I'm thinking like the oldest is maybe 8 or 9, 4 or 5 for the youngest. And so we really, we had to decide for a great road trip, you're going to be able to put together something great. So now we know our destination. We're narrowing our focus down. And so now this destination is going to give us a structure. Now, you got to ask yourself questions. How far do you live from this place? So I live in New England. I live in Connecticut. So I have to decide, okay, so how are we going to get there? Are we going to drive? Now, you can drive, but that's going to take a whole day of driving to get from here to Ohio. And with kids, you're going to be stopping. So that's the other thing you have to think about. Now that you've answered your question of who's coming, and then your next step of your destination, it's like, okay, so now I have to know that when I'm with kids, I'm stopping every 2 to 3 hours no matter what. And sometimes even pushing to the 2 hour mark could be tough for some kids. I'm not saying it can't happen, but you have to remember who's in the car with you. You have to remember, okay, so we just ate, they had something to drink, what are we gonna do? So you have to think about those things too. So if we drive, we're gonna spend a whole day traveling. Now the thing is too, if we fly, we might be spending a whole day traveling too. So that's the downfall. But the thing about flying is that if you can fly to your destination, then you can start your destination almost right away. So if you do get an early flight, it might work out in your advantage that you can go check out the local area. Now, if you're driving, you may have to stop overnight because with your, having kids in the car, you're not going to get there as quick as if it's a solo or if it's just adults. You might be able to push to the 3 hour mark and be totally fine. But with kids, you have to really stop. You have to. I know sometimes people are going to be like, I got kids that they can be in the car forever. That's great. I'm happy for you. But the majority of people is that kids are kids. They need to stop. They need to move around. Even adults need to stretch. So I'm just putting that out there. So now it highlights how multiple destinations can help you with your thing now. So now you have your main destination is Ohio. Now you have to start putting together your itinerary. Now, before you jump into your itinerary, I want to focus on something, and that's your budget. Why does your budget matter? It keeps spending aligned with your expectations. So what does that mean? So now you know, okay, so we're going on this big trip. It's going to cost us $5,000. And so now you're like, okay, well, we can pick points of interest, but we can't pick 5 or 6 in one day and spend $200-300 per point of interest. Like getting into the Football Hall of Fame, it costs money to get in, even for your kids. You have to buy a ticket to get in. You want to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you have to buy tickets to get in. Even your kids have to pay. My kids are at an age where they're not babies anymore, so at this time, we had to pay for tickets for them. Then also the Columbus Zoo, you have to pay a ticket there. The Wilds, you have to buy a ticket there. So there's all these places that you have to think about, because the reason why you have your budget is that you can have the expectation of where your budget's going to go. So this avoids regret of overspending. And so that's the main part I want to talk about right now, is that I think a lot of times we can have a great time on a trip. We can have an awesome, fun time. But when you come home and you have to pay more money on this trip than you thought. So you budgeted for $5,000, but now you paid $7,000 or $8,000 because you didn't budget. So even though you were like, well, I had $5,000, but the reason you budget is to break it down so you understand how much you can spend per day too. And it keeps you on track. And I also think while you're on the trip, you might want to track a little bit just to make sure that you're not overspending too. And so let's take things like, this protects long-term happiness of the trip too. So you're not just like, that was a great trip, but we spent so much money. Do you remember how much money we spent? Yeah, that trip was a lot of money. And so now you're at this place where you're just like complaining about your trip, where it was supposed to be this great moment. And so I want to pause here for 1 second. I want to, give a shout out to my wife, Kate, because my wife, Kate, when it comes to budgeting, she is awesome at it. And so a lot of times we'll have all these things we want to do. She'll structure a budget. We'll sit down together and we'll go over it. I may add a couple of things. I may say, do we really need this? Do we really need that? And then we'll work out the budget together. But she's really good at creating a budget and also even sticking to it too when we're on trips. And I can be a little cheap. I'm the cheaper person, and that's just how I grew up. I try to get the cheaper thing, even though I might have to buy it 2 or 3 times, but that's for another day. But I just wanted to give a shout out to my wife, Kate, who's great at budgeting. Thank you, honey, because you always do a great job. All right, so we're in Ohio, right? So now we know what we're going to pay for. We're going to pay for the zoo, we're going to pay for the Hall of Fame, we're going to pay for the wilds. And then we find other affordable choices along the way. So one thing we decided to do was we flew. So then we have to budget for a plane ticket. Then we have to budget for renting a car, all these things, budget for gas, things like that. So here's a couple budget tips. Estimate the cost for tickets, food, lodging, and gas. Those are your basic things that you're going to budget for. Then you build a fun fund. And a lot of times I may just call it miscellaneous for surprises. So this is the one thing about budgeting that I think everyone needs to put together. And that is that you want to have a separate budget where if something happens where you're like, we really want to do this, like something popped up, you've planned that in already. So say it's like $200-300 you have to the side because you want to make sure that if something pops up, you're just like, man, we really got to do that. We can do it, budgeted for it. And so that's what you want to make sure you do. Make sure you have little extra categories and make sure you have everything. So, think about when you're thinking about lodging, like think about, do you want anything extra? Are you going to get breakfast there? I mean, food is tough to budget because you may know your family pretty good and that's great. But if you're going on trips with other people, make sure that you know what you're going to get. Like, you know how much you usually spend. You stick to yourself, but that's for another trip. But you want to create categories that help you. Don't just go ahead and be like, we've got $5,000, let's go. Because you can also try to find deals, discounts, but plan for full price so you don't get caught off guard. I think that's one of the most important things. So let's say you're going somewhere and you know it's $40 a person and there is 4 of you, right? So that's $160. So now you're at $160 and you're like, but maybe I can get a discount. Maybe I can get this. Just plan the full price out. The reason you want to do that is that, say for some reason you can't find a discount and you get there and you just have to pay the $160. Now, maybe you get there in a special day and they're like, hey, we're giving, I don't know, they're doing 50% off. So instead of paying the $160, you get to do $80. And those are the things but you want to plan the full price. Be prepared to pay full price. You're on a trip. And if you go to a place that is a destination place, they're jacking up the prices. And if it's that season, they're definitely jacking up the prices. So you got to be prepared for that. Okay. So budgeting. I believe that budgeting is the most important. It is the most important thing that you want to do when planning a trip. I think other than anything else, budgeting is it. And the reason is you want to know the other 2 questions first and then know your budget, because your budget's going to help, because you need to know where you're going. You need to know who's coming so you can create a great budget. And that's the thing. That's why budgeting is so important. And this is why I'll keep pushing this and pushing this till probably my final breath, is that please budget, because you want to make sure you don't come back and feel like you hated that trip, even though, listen, your kids aren't going to notice this stuff. Your kids are probably going to be like, man, that was an amazing trip. Do you remember that? And you're like, yeah, I remember that trip. That trip was so expensive. But your kids had a great time and you're trying to help them. And that's what we do as parents. We're trying to create great memories for our kids and give them experiences. And that's awesome. But we have to remember that we have to prepare for those expectations. And I get that this is tough. Sometimes it's like, I just want to go on a trip. I just want to get going. Because, the problem is you might overspend, a couple $100, couple $1,000. And you're like, oh man, I never want to go on a trip again. But your kids are like, it was so amazing. And you're just like, no, it just was horrible. So I would say make sure you budget, because you want to be prepared for these things. So in recapping all these things, remember, number 1, first question, who's coming and what kind of trip is it? You need that question answered before you can really get going. What's your destination? The reason you want to answer question 1 is because a couple's trip, you're going to go to somewhere different, probably a destination that you may not take your kids. It just happens. And then number two, knowing your destination can help you start preparing for your budget. Because now you know, hey, am I going to fly there? Am I going to drive there? And then you're ready to start breaking. And that's why you want to do this in that order. Now, I think like a year or two ago on my old podcast, it's on Apple Podcasts and it's on Spotify, and it's called My Road Trips Planner. But they're probably about 5 minutes or so, maybe up to 15 max. But the thing that I would say is like you can probably switch the first two questions. I've come to a point where I think I've traveled a lot more in the last few years, that knowing who's coming is going to set the pace for the rest of your planning. So I would start with that. Number two, what's my destination? And number three, what's my budget? So with Ohio, asking these three questions made the trip smoother. We were able to figure out everybody's gonna, and we would tell our kids, hey, what do you want to do? Things like that. We'll talk about that in another podcast, points of interest, and time, because time will dictate your budget and how you're going to use it. So final thought, budget isn't about restriction, it's about freedom. Knowing you can enjoy the trip without all these regrets later. And I think that's the biggest point about this theme of this podcast, is I want you to go on trips. I want you to have an amazing time. I want you to have fun. But I want you to be able to come back and feel like, I want to do that again. We budgeted properly. We went to the right places because everybody had a voice. We knew who was coming. And then we were able to structure the trip properly. So I say all this. Thanks for watching. This is My Road Trips Planner, the podcast. My name is Shane, your host. And as you know, in closing, as I always say, the road's open. Let's drive.